Hey there, night owls. Before we settle in for the evening, I want you to take a breath. Let the day fall off your shoulders, let the light fade from the room, and let your mind wander back through time. Because tonight, we're not just telling stories, we're uncovering truths that history tried very hard to forget. This isn't your average historical recap. It's not about kings or revolutions. It's about something far quieter and far more dangerous. We're going to trace the shadowy thread of how women's fear, stress, and mental exhaustion were dismissed, disguised, or punished. Not because the pain wasn't real, but because it was never convenient to listen. From desert temples to candlelit drawing rooms, from whispered prayers to locked doors. This is the untold chronicle of how women's inner lives were misread as chaos, their grief misdiagnosed as fragility, and their cries rewritten as curses. And maybe, just maybe, we'll start to understand how those echoes are still with us today. So get comfortable. Put on your softest blanket. Maybe light a candle, or let the hum of the night keep you company. Because we're starting our journey now, in a place most people have never thought to look. Long before marble columns rose in the Mediterranean, before scrolls filled with philosophy were inked in Athens, a different civilization thrived along the banks of a life-giving river. Ancient Kemet, what we now call Egypt, was a realm of cosmic order, sacred rituals, and divine hierarchies. But amid the gold-laced tombs and star maps painted on ceilings, there was something no priest or healer could fully explain: the torment of a woman's unrest. Imagine you're a woman living around 1550 BCE in the bustling city of Wasit. You come from a family of scribes. Your mother knows herbs, your father copies sacred texts. You've been feeling strange lately, uneasy. You wake in the middle of the night sweating even though it's cool. Your chest tightens, you cry for no reason, and your stomach aches like something is sinking inside you. You visit the temple physician, expecting answers, maybe comfort. Instead, you're told your ka, your spiritual essence, is out of harmony. He consults a scroll written generations ago. There it is, female disturbance of the heart, believed to be a sign that a woman has angered a goddess or been cursed by an ancestor. The solution? A purification ritual involving lotus oil, fasting, and sleeping under certain constellations. You're told not to speak of your visions or your fear, that doing so will stir the demons. But you are not possessed. You are anxious. You are overwhelmed. And instead of someone asking why, they ask you to silence the storm inside. The healers meant well, perhaps. Their understanding of the body was often remarkably advanced for its time. They knew of pulse, diet, childbirth, but emotions, especially in women, were viewed not as signals but as signs, not as responses but as flaws in alignment. The idea of psychological distress didn't exist, only spiritual imbalance. And for women, imbalance always pointed inward. In wealthier families, afflicted women were brought to sacred gardens for rest, where they were fed specific fruits and bathed in oils to cool the blood. But poorer women? They had no gardens, no oils. They carried their fear in silence, working in fields, raising children, or preparing grain by hand day after day. If they wept, it was assumed they were tired. If they screamed, they were left alone. And so began a pattern, an ancient echo of treating women's pain not as a message but as a mystery, to be buried beneath incense and chants. Not as something to ask about, but as something to hide. Of course, it wasn't always so. In certain temples, some female healers did emerge, wise women who learned through generations of observing other women, who knew the difference between a soul in danger and a mind under strain. They whispered knowledge to one another beneath moonlight. Quiet theories, quiet empathy, but nothing was ever written down. What is not written is easily forgotten. Now let's drift eastward, across desert winds and merchant roads to a time when empires were young and medicine was beginning to be mapped, not by stars, but by scrolls. In the heart of ancient Mesopotamia, around 1300 BCE, another woman sits beside a clay tablet, her hands trembling. She is the daughter of a merchant, and she's just been returned to her family from a shrine, where she was taken after being accused of losing her clarity. The cause? She stopped speaking for several days. Her eyes stared at nothing. She refused to eat. The elders believed she had been touched by a spirit. The local priest conducted rites, offerings were made, but nothing helped. Now home, she sits silently while her family prays louder. No one asked her why she stopped speaking. No one wondered if she had seen something she couldn't unsee, if someone had hurt her, if she had been forced into something against her will. No one asked if she was afraid, because fear in women back then was dangerous, not just to them, but to the order of the household, to the laws of the gods. Fear, if acknowledged, could lead to questioning. And questioning, that was never welcome. So instead of support, she is given instructions. Eat this herb, burn this offering, bathe in this water, and stay quiet. Always stay quiet. You see, across early civilizations, emotional turmoil in women was rarely explored as a response to experience. It was explained through spirits, imbalances, gods, demons, or moral failures. And every diagnosis served one purpose: control. Control the behavior. Control the voice. Control the tears. The idea that a woman might simply be reacting to fear, grief, loss, stress was far too radical. Because if her pain had a cause, it might need to be addressed. And to address it would require a society that cared more about listening than preserving order. We can't blame them fully. Their world was still young. They lacked our language, our understanding of trauma, our maps of the mind. But even in those early years, some women knew. They felt the pull in their chests, the breathlessness, the waking in dread. And they carried those invisible weights day after day, century after century. Some wrote poems, some carved prayers, some painted symbols, small traces left behind, hints that they were here, that they were feeling too much in a world that allowed them to express so little. And those traces matter, because they remind us that anxiety is not new. It is not modern. It is not weakness. It is as ancient as fire. And women have been trying to name it for millennia. We'll continue this journey together. Through candlelit apothecaries, through stone towers and locked doors, through courtrooms and clinics and couches. But for now, let's pause. As we transition from the ancient civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia, we find ourselves in the Middle Ages, a period often characterized by its deep religiosity and rigid societal structures. During this era, the understanding of mental health, particularly in women, was heavily influenced by theological interpretations. Emotional distress in women was frequently attributed to spiritual failings or demonic possession, rather than psychological or physiological causes. In medieval Europe, the Church held significant sway over societal norms and medical practices. Women exhibiting signs of anxiety, depression, or other mental health issues were often viewed with suspicion. Behaviors such as excessive weeping, withdrawal from social activities, or expressions of fear could be interpreted as evidence of spiritual weakness or even witchcraft. This perspective led to the marginalization and, in many cases, persecution of women who were already vulnerable due to their mental health struggles. Revelare Recovery Center. The treatment methods during this period were deeply entwined with religious rituals. Exorcisms, prayer, and penance were commonly prescribed to cure women of their afflictions. In more severe cases, women were confined to convents or asylums, isolated from society under the guise of spiritual rehabilitation. These institutions often lacked the understanding or resources to provide genuine care, leading to further deterioration of the women's mental health. It's crucial to recognize that these practices were not merely the result of ignorance, but were also tools of control. By framing women's mental health issues as moral or spiritual failings, society could justify the suppression of women's voices and autonomy. This systemic silencing had long-lasting effects, contributing to the stigma surrounding women's mental health that persists in various forms to this day. Despite these oppressive conditions, some women found ways to express their experiences and advocate for themselves. Through letters, poetry, and other forms of writing, they documented their struggles and sought understanding. These personal accounts provide invaluable insights into the lived experiences of women during the Middle Ages and serve as early testaments to the resilience and agency of women in the face of systemic oppression. As we reflect on this period, it's essential to acknowledge the complex interplay between religion, societal norms, and the treatment of women's mental health. The Middle Ages were a time of significant hardship for many women, but they also laid the groundwork for future discussions and reforms in mental health care. In our next segment, we'll explore how the Renaissance period brought about shifts in thought and the gradual emergence of more nuanced understandings of mental health. The Renaissance is often remembered as an era of flourishing beauty, rebirth, and revolutionary thought. Names like Botticelli, Galileo, and Da Vinci still echo in classrooms and galleries, their brilliance credited with pulling Europe out of the long shadow of the Middle Ages. But beneath the vaulted ceilings of cathedrals and the brushstrokes of masterworks, there existed another reality, one that history rarely hangs on a museum wall. It is the story of how the Renaissance, for all its genius and grandeur, remained a prison of silence for the anxious, the sorrowful, and the overwhelmed woman. Picture Florence in the 1470s. The streets are vibrant with trade and conversation. Art is in bloom, humanism is taking root, and the printing press is whispering knowledge into corners previously untouched. You are a woman of moderate standing, educated just enough to read poetry, to appreciate paintings, to know that your thoughts do not match the joy others expect from you. Lately you've been restless, your hands tremble when you thread your embroidery, your appetite slips away and sleep evades you like a dream you once caught but can't recall. You confide in your family, hoping for compassion, but they offer a different solution. More fresh air, your brother insists. Less reading, your father suggests. You're simply too sensitive. In this age, sensitivity is not a temperament, it is a problem. A woman's emotional expression is still seen not as a reflection of the world around her, but as an internal malfunction. Despite the revival of classical learning, most medical opinions still attribute emotional instability to the old theories of bodily humors, imbalances of blood, black bile, yellow bile, and phlegm. If a woman appears melancholic, it is believed her humors are misaligned. And thus, the remedies begin. Cupping to release excess fluids, bloodletting to restore balance, hot compresses, bitter tonics, purgatives. You are not asked about grief. You are not asked about fear. You are drained, literally, and expected to recover. The irony is stark. While the male mind is celebrated, nurtured, inspired, and dissected, the female mind is still feared. An anxious man might be described as sensitive, thoughtful, or even tortured in a way that elevates his status. An anxious woman? She is unstable, hysterical. A fragile ornament who must be preserved through silence, confinement, or in some cases marriage. Because nothing stabilizes a nervous woman like assigning her the responsibility of children, household management, and complete submission to a husband's will. Even among the intellectual elite, conversations about female mental health are tinged with condescension. A physician may write a paper detailing female complaints, but it reads more like a behavioral manual than a medical text. The uterus still haunts these pages, no longer wandering as in Hippocratic lore, but now believed to emit vapors that cloud a woman's reason. And so, physicians prescribe long walks, gentle music, and complete avoidance of literature that might stimulate excessive imagination. Yes, books are seen as dangerous, for women at least. Too much reading might inflame the mind. A novel might introduce thoughts of rebellion or dissatisfaction. A play might stir desires deemed inappropriate. In truth, the only knowledge truly sanctioned for women is the knowledge of obedience, how to smile when afraid, how to serve while breaking, how to weep without a sound. In some noble households, women are sent to countryside retreats. These are meant as places of recovery, where nervous complaints can be soothed by fresh air and natural surroundings. But the tranquility is often a performance. Women are supervised, instructed to remain docile, discouraged from journaling or expressing discontent. Their minds are not mended, they are muted. And over time, the silence becomes a kind of second skin. But not all women submit to the quiet. In shadowed corners of this gilded age, certain women begin to write in code, through poetry, through allegory, through private letters. They describe unnamed sadness, unexplained dread, haunting dreams. Their words survive in fragments, tucked between the pages of philosophy and beauty. They are not often cited in historical accounts. Their names are not etched in marble, but they are there, ghosts in the archive, murmuring their truths through time. One such woman, the daughter of a spice merchant in Venice, kept a journal hidden inside a false-bottomed jewelry box. In it, she described what we might now call panic attacks, episodes of rapid breathing, an overwhelming sense of doom, the urge to flee even when no danger was present. She wrote of being confined for episodes of melancholy, where she was denied food for a day and forced to confess sins she could not name. "Perhaps the sin is being born with a voice I cannot use," she wrote. That line remains, scratched in fading ink, more than 500 years old. It is easy from the modern vantage point to look at these stories and judge the ignorance of the time. But doing so misses the point. These societies were not just uninformed, they were afraid. Afraid of what women's emotions might reveal about the systems built around them. If too many women expressed discontent, perhaps people would begin to question the institutions those women served: marriage, religion, inheritance, power. Better to label them unwell than to ask if they were right. And so the Renaissance, for all its progress, offered women very little when it came to mental health. The era that celebrated balance and beauty could not comprehend a woman who was out of step with the rhythm. The world honored paintings of Venus and poems of devotion, but ignored the real Venus who wept into her sleeve, the woman behind the poem who couldn't sleep, the wife of the poet who felt like screaming. Still, the story does not end here. Because just as the Renaissance planted seeds of inquiry and observation, it also laid groundwork, however fragile, for future transformation. Ideas were shifting, even if slowly. Texts, once locked in monasteries, were being copied and spread. Some physicians began to question the rigid interpretations of emotional behavior. A few even dared to suggest that sorrow was not always a sin, that fear was not always madness, that a woman's despair might not be divine punishment, but human reaction. The groundwork was subtle, but it was there. And it would take centuries, revolutions, and relentless voices to see it bloom. The next chapter in our journey brings us into an age of reason, where science sharpens its tools, and men in powdered wigs begin speaking of liberty, gravity, and nature's laws. But even as they mapped the stars and unlocked equations, many still failed to ask the most basic question of all: what if a woman's fear is not the problem, but the clue? The 18th century dawned with promise. The Enlightenment proclaimed itself as a revolution of thought, a time when logic would replace superstition, when reason would triumph over ignorance, and when the mysteries of nature, human nature included, would finally be unveiled. Philosophers debated liberty, rights, and education. Scientists explored the stars, dissected frogs, and cataloged diseases. Intellectual salons buzzed with discussions about the mind and soul. And yet, for all the glowing rhetoric, there remained a dark and silent corner of this supposed progress: the private and often painful experience of women's mental anguish. This was the century when emotional suffering in women was rebranded, not understood. The old curses and spiritual accusations of the Middle Ages were replaced by a far more insidious label: nervous disorder. It sounded clinical, modern, even compassionate. But the truth behind the term was anything but. It was a delicate euphemism, carefully crafted by male physicians to categorize female distress without ever addressing its root. Women were not angry or oppressed or afraid. They were simply nervous, fragile creatures too finely tuned to withstand the pressure of rational society. Imagine you are a young woman in London, 1742. Your family is of modest means, but your father, an aspiring legal advisor, has managed to educate you beyond the usual sewing and etiquette. You love reading, especially essays by Mary Astell, and early female thinkers whose voices challenged the status quo. But lately, something has shifted in you. You wake with dread. Your hands tremble over your breakfast tea and your breath comes in shallow gasps when guests arrive. Sometimes you feel as though the walls are closing in, though they remain still. Your mother urges you to lie down. Your aunt insists you've been reading too much. And your doctor? He diagnoses you with a case of feminine nerves. His prescription: warm milk, a brisk walk in the garden, and absolute rest. If symptoms persist, perhaps a spoonful of laudanum, a compound of alcohol and opium, will help ease the disorder of your delicate constitution. Your mind is not engaged. It is subdued. Your questions are not answered. They are silenced. This was not rare. In fact, it was the defining model of female treatment in this era. As the scientific method flourished in laboratories and universities, it somehow stopped short of truly examining the female psyche. Women were still seen as emotionally excessive, mentally vulnerable, and biologically predisposed to weakness. The uterus was no longer blamed for wandering, but the belief remained that a woman's physical makeup made her temperamentally unsuited for intellectual or civic life. The nervous system became the new villain, and women, apparently, had far too much of it. Medical texts from the time are filled with observations of nervous ladies, women who could not sleep, who wept without reason, who complained of phantom ailments or racing thoughts. Their descriptions are rich in poetic language, sensitive to the weather, consumed by melancholy, afflicted with tremors of the spirit, yet lacking in actual empathy. There was no curiosity about why so many women were suffering. No questions about the toll of constant obedience, isolation, or loss of autonomy. Only treatments, rest, quiet, sedatives. And if those failed, seclusion in the countryside, far from the bustle of city life that was thought to overstimulate the feminine brain. But what was really happening in those countryside retreats? For many women, they became cages lined in silk. Servants brought meals, yes. The air was fresh, the scenery pastoral. But the restrictions were absolute. No writing, no politics, no visitors who might excite emotion. These so-called retreats were designed not to heal the mind, but to dull it. If a woman could not conform to the emotional standards of polite society, she would be hidden away until she did, or until she learned to pretend well enough to be released. Of course, this was the age of letters and journals. Some women wrote in secret, preserving their internal landscapes on paper that would never be published in their lifetimes. One such woman, a baker's wife in Lyon, wrote of the shaking hollowness she felt each morning, a sensation she described as waking inside a coffin. Her husband believed she was possessed by sorrow. The physician who visited twice a month called her condition domestic melancholia and advised that she give up housework and spend more time praying. When she resisted, he accused her of vanity, of craving attention. Her account survives only because a friend smuggled her diary out before the local priest burned her belongings after her death. Even the most respected Enlightenment thinkers had blind spots when it came to women. While Rousseau spoke eloquently about education and natural rights, he argued that women should be taught obedience above all else, as their natural role was to serve men's needs. While Locke laid the groundwork for modern psychology, he made no serious inquiry into female mental health. While Voltaire praised liberty, he remained silent on the liberty of the mind, if that mind happened to belong to a woman. Yet among these giants, there were glimmers of resistance. Some women began to carve spaces for themselves in the discourse. Writers like Mary Wollstonecraft challenged the notion that women's minds were inherently inferior. In her vindication of the rights of woman, she argued that the emotional fragility so often associated with her sex was not natural, but a result of denial of education, independence, and agency. Her words were revolutionary, but they were also dangerous. Women who echoed them were often dismissed as hysterics, radicals, or worse. And so the paradox of the Enlightenment revealed itself. An era of light that still cloaked half the population in darkness, a period of progress that insisted on the stasis of women's roles. a philosophy of reason that found no reason to ask why so many women were afraid, exhausted, or silently suffering. But beneath the polished prose and powdered wigs, the silence was beginning to crack. The more women read, the more they wrote. The more they whispered to one another, the louder their collective voice became. In salons and drawing rooms, in kitchen corners and garden walks, they began to share their stories. Quietly at first, but persistently. They questioned the nervous woman label. They resisted the sedatives, the countryside, the isolation. Some fled, some faked recovery. Some fought, quietly, through ink and thought and breath. And though they did not yet have the language of trauma, they understood its shape. They understood what it meant to be overwhelmed by invisible forces, to feel the weight of expectations pressing down on their lungs. They knew what it was to cry in silence, to scream in dreams, to speak in metaphors because direct speech was dangerous. Their world did not listen. Not yet. But their daughters, and their daughters' daughters, would inherit the traces of that resistance. They would read between the lines of old medical texts. They would see the truth in the trembling margins, and they would begin to ask the questions that had been ignored for centuries. Because fear, when shared, becomes something else. It becomes testimony. It becomes history. It becomes a thread that binds generations of women across time and space. Next, we enter the 19th century, an age of velvet and iron, of industrial advancement and rigid social codes, where corsets tightened around not just waists but emotions, and where a new cure was offered for the suffering woman. Absolute rest and absolute silence. The rest cure would rise, and many would never return. The 19th century unfolded with ambition. Factories bloomed across skylines, locomotives shrieked their way into every countryside, and cities multiplied like the ambitions of the men who built them. The world was changing faster than ever before. Electricity danced through wires. Telephones carried voices across space. Yet within the homes of polite society, homes filled with polished mahogany and portrait-lined parlors, there existed a darkness as persistent as coal smoke. It crept behind the drapes, tucked itself into the folds of corsets, and pressed heavily upon the chests of women who could not sleep, could not stop weeping, could not name what they felt without being punished for it. To live as a woman during the Victorian era was to exist in a theater of perfection. Appearances were everything. Composure was queen. A lady of status was expected to be graceful, nurturing, serene, and absolutely untroubled. Emotion, if expressed at all, was allowed only in the form of delicate sentimentality. Anything stronger, grief, rage, fear, was labeled inappropriate, even dangerous. And so, when those emotions inevitably surfaced, the response was swift and brutal in its subtlety. Not with violence or fire, but with the iron glove of medical authority, of husbandly concern, of motherly shame disguised as help. The rest cure became the fashionable solution to women's nervous disorders. Coined and promoted by an American neurologist in the latter half of the century, the treatment promised to restore feminine peace through complete passivity. The afflicted woman, diagnosed with neurasthenia or hysteria, was confined to her bed, forbidden from reading, writing, or engaging in conversation. She was bathed, spoon-fed, and observed. For weeks, sometimes months. Her only task was to lie still and get better. But in truth, she was expected to do something far more sinister, to stop existing in any form that might challenge the comfort of those around her. Imagine a woman named Eleanor, born into a well-off family in Manchester, 1873. Her childhood was spent under the gaze of governesses and tutors. She learned the pianoforte, recited Wordsworth at family gatherings, and hosted tea by 16. But when her father died suddenly, something in her unraveled. She stopped playing music. Her letters became erratic. She walked at night unable to rest, her thoughts spinning with dread. Her mother summoned a doctor who declared her nerves to be in disrepair. Too much thinking, he said with authority. The cure? She was placed in a silent room, the curtains drawn to avoid overstimulation. Meals of boiled milk and dry toast were delivered on a tray. Her books were removed. Her journals burned. She was to be made calm, or made invisible. This experience, though horrifying, was common. The rest cure was celebrated by medical journals and endorsed in drawing rooms. It was performed not out of cruelty, but out of conviction. Conviction that women's minds, when overexerted, could fracture like glass. The cure was not about healing. It was about returning women to their roles, smoothing out their rough edges until they fit the mold of Victorian femininity once more. The famous short story, The Yellow Wallpaper, written by a woman who underwent the rest cure herself, captures the quiet madness of this treatment. The protagonist descends into psychosis, not because of her illness, but because of the forced silence imposed upon her. Her only stimulus is the sickly yellow pattern on her bedroom wall, a pattern she eventually sees as a prison filled with trapped, crawling women. The metaphor is clear. The cure is not a balm, it is a cage. Yet not every woman received this velvet cage. For those without wealth or social standing, the experience was far harsher. Working-class women who displayed signs of distress were often sent to public asylums, where the treatments ranged from cruel to barbaric. Electroshock therapy, ice baths, prolonged isolation, forced labor, these were not rare. A woman might find herself institutionalized for reasons as trivial as crying too much, speaking out of turn, refusing to marry, or simply aging without children. Once admitted, there was rarely an exit plan. Consider the story of Lisette, a French seamstress who began experiencing what we now call panic attacks. She fainted often at her sewing table. Her employer, frustrated by her unpredictability, accused her of malingering. When she wept and trembled during a physician's exam, he claimed she was unfit for labor. The asylum admitted her the next morning. There, she was given 3 rounds of hydrotherapy a week, immersion in freezing water until her body went limp. She was denied contact with family. Her condition worsened. Her fear grew. And still, no one asked why she was afraid. The logic was terrifying in its simplicity. If a woman could not function quietly and reliably, she was broken. And broken things were either fixed or hidden. But fixing, in this context, rarely meant understanding. It meant suppressing symptoms until they were no longer visible. And if a woman did not respond to rest or routine, if she continued to question, to grieve, to rage, then more drastic methods were applied. Sedatives, isolation, restraint. In some cases, early surgical interventions. By the end of the century, lobotomies were on the rise. Though more prominent in the 20th century, their early roots began here, with the belief that some women's minds were simply too wild to be trusted. All of this unfolded beneath a layer of politeness. The Victorian ideal of womanhood, gentle, moral, obedient, was a mask pressed tightly onto every face. The pain behind it was real, but acknowledging that pain threatened the entire social order, and so the mask remained suffocating and beautiful like lace wrapped around the mouth. Still, as with every era, there were rebels, women who wrote under pseudonyms, who smuggled letters from asylums, who founded small groups to discuss the unspeakable. A few physicians began to question the prevailing wisdom. Female doctors, rare but determined, entered the field and brought with them the radical idea that maybe, just maybe, women were not inherently flawed, that perhaps society was the illness, not the woman. In the parlors of New York, the clubs of Paris, and the quiet drawing rooms of Vienna, the early seeds of change began to bloom. But for every woman who found her voice, there were thousands who did not, who lay in dark rooms counting cracks in ceilings, who swallowed bitter tonics and worse, who learned that in a world obsessed with order, their disorder would never be safe. And so the Victorian era passed, leaving behind architecture that still stands, novels still taught, and silence that still lingers. The corsets may be gone, the curtains opened, but the idea that women must suffer quietly has not yet fully died. We now move into a new century, one that promises revolution and reform, where a man named Freud begins to ask new questions, and where the couch replaces the cage. But are these questions any better? And do they lead to truth or simply another kind of silence, this time disguised as interpretation? The 20th century began with tremors of transformation. Empires crumbled, new nations emerged, and revolutions burned across continents. The world was unraveling and rewriting itself in real time. But while politics restructured borders and industry surged with machines and electricity, the quiet inner landscapes of women remained obscured by layers of theory, assumptions, and intellectual detours dressed as discovery. In dusty rooms lined with books and the scent of pipe smoke, men gathered to study the human mind. But when they looked at women, they didn't see experience. They saw symbols. They didn't hear stories. They heard symptoms. And the most influential among them, Sigmund Freud, didn't just want to treat the female psyche. He wanted to decode it, like a strange and ancient language that only he could translate. Freud's arrival on the stage of mental health marked a turning point. With the birth of psychoanalysis, the field of psychology moved from the asylum to the study, from restraints to reflection. The idea was groundbreaking. Instead of suppressing or sedating, a patient would talk. They would lie on a couch, close their eyes, and speak freely. The analyst would listen, observe, and interpret. Dreams became maps. Slips of the tongue became evidence. Everything had meaning, but whose meaning? And who got to decide? Imagine a woman named Margarete, a Viennese piano teacher in 1912. Her life is comfortable, but lately she's been visited by strange episodes. Moments where her body feels foreign, where she is overcome with sadness and fear without cause. Her husband, a businessman, dismisses it as stress. A friend recommends the new talking cure. Margaret is intrigued. For the first time, someone wants to hear her story. Or so she thinks. She visits a well-known analyst, pays her fee, reclines on the long leather couch and begins. She talks of her childhood, her strained relationship with her mother, her loneliness. The doctor listens, nods, takes notes. But then he begins to explain. Her fear, he says, is sexual repression. Her sadness? Oedipal guilt. Her faintness? Disguised desire. Soon the focus shifts from what happened to her to what she must secretly want. The pain is no longer her response to life. It is reinterpreted as failure to process libido, as resistance to inner truths she does not remember asking for. This was the core of psychoanalytic treatment in its early decades. Women's anxiety, depression, compulsions, and panic were not viewed as reactions to trauma, grief, or oppression. They were seen as symbolic, rooted in suppressed sexual drives or unresolved childhood conflict. Freud and his disciples believed that mental illness emerged not from external injustice, but from internal struggle, often erotic in nature. And so, instead of being asked what scared them, women were asked to describe their dreams about staircases. Instead of talking about their marriages, they were told to explore their relationship with their fathers. Every emotion became a metaphor. Every metaphor pointed to desire. And if a patient disagreed, it meant she was in denial. Of course, there was progress hidden within the theory. Freud did open a door that had long been locked. He recognized that the mind could be both conscious and unconscious, that buried memories and emotions could shape behavior in ways unseen. For many men, this was a revelation. But for women, especially those already labeled fragile, it became another trap. Their pain was no longer ignored. It was reimagined. And this reimagining, though clever, often left them feeling more lost than before. Therapy became a performance. A woman arrived with questions about her life and left with a diagnosis about her inner child. Her fear of intimacy was traced to her mother's absence. Her panic was reduced to symbolic castration. Her self-doubt became a sign of unresolved attraction to her analyst. And if she dared question the logic, the analyst might smile and say, "Resistance, a classic case." Even worse, this model spread quickly among the educated elite. In cities like Paris, Berlin, New York, Buenos Aires, the psychoanalytic couch became a fashionable fixture among the upper classes. Women who once would have been hidden away were now invited to speak. but only within the narrow constraints of theory. They were not really being heard. They were being interpreted, not believed, but decoded. And for many, that subtle invalidation was just as painful as silence. What's more, the early psychoanalytic field was almost entirely male. The analysts, the theorists, the authors, they were interpreting women's dreams, bodies, and emotions from the outside in. Their authority went unchallenged for decades, but beneath the surface, resistance simmered. Some female patients began to write about their experiences, detailing how their voices were twisted into symbols that didn't fit. Others left therapy altogether, disillusioned by the way their suffering was reframed as pathology. And yet, in the midst of this intellectual maelstrom, cracks began to form in the old paradigms. A few women managed to breach the walls of psychoanalysis, not as patients but as practitioners. Analysts like Karen Horney and Melanie Klein emerged, still steeped in the tradition, but daring to challenge its foundations. Horney argued that much of women's distress came not from anatomy or repressed libido, but from the cultural limitations placed upon them. She named something Freud had refused to, that society itself might be a source of trauma, that gendered expectations might be more damaging than suppressed desires. These insights, however, remained largely confined to academic journals and select intellectual circles. For the vast majority of women in the early 20th century, mental health treatment still mirrored the assumptions of the past. If you were a middle-class housewife in 1925, suffering from what we would now call generalized anxiety, your options were limited. You might be prescribed sedatives, early barbiturates, or told to limit your social activities. You could seek psychoanalysis if you had the money, but you risked being told that your fear of losing your children was rooted not in maternal instinct, but in sexual rivalry with your own mother. And if you were poor, you didn't even get a couch. Women in working-class neighborhoods who exhibited signs of mental distress were still often institutionalized, sometimes involuntarily. The new century had couches for the rich and locked wards for the poor. Progress was selective, uneven, and deeply stratified by class. It's important not to romanticize the early psychoanalytic era. It opened doors, yes, but it also created new forms of imprisonment. It replaced demonology with diagnostics, superstition with symbolism. But it did not yet see women as whole people. It did not ask what had happened to them. It asked what was wrong with them. And in that fundamental failure, it reproduced the harm it claimed to cure. Still, something was shifting. The very act of talking, even within limiting frameworks, began to unlock a deeper truth. Women had stories. Stories that were not metaphors. Stories that did not need translation. The question was whether anyone would listen to them on their own terms. As the decades rolled forward, the pace of change would quicken. The Second World War would upend societal roles. Medications would begin to flood the market. And in shiny kitchens under fluorescent lights, a new figure would emerge. The suburban housewife with a pill in one hand and a question in her heart. Why does it still hurt? And so, with Freud behind us and the modern age looming ahead, we step into the mid-20th century, a world of conformity, consumerism, and chemical solutions, where anxiety would be marketed as a manageable nuisance, and the cure would come in a bottle labeled peace. The war had ended. The world was rebuilding. Soldiers returned, cities recovered, and a new image of happiness began to circulate in advertisements, television shows, and glossy magazines. It was a woman in a full skirt and pearls, standing beside a spotless kitchen counter, smiling warmly as she served dinner to her husband and children. She was the embodiment of mid-century femininity, calm, content, composed. But behind that smile, beneath the apron, many of these women were quietly unraveling, and rather than ask why they were suffering, society simply offered them a pill. The 1950s introduced a new chapter in the treatment of women's mental health, one that replaced psychoanalysis with pharmacology, silence with sedation. No longer seen as symbols of repressed desire or haunted souls, anxious women were now classified as tired, overwhelmed, or emotionally strained. And the solution was not therapy. It was chemistry. Enter Miltown, the first widely prescribed tranquilizer, followed quickly by Librium and then Valium, nicknamed Mother's Little Helper. These pills were marketed directly to housewives, promising peace of mind, emotional balance, and above all, compliance. Imagine a woman named Joan, living in suburban Illinois in 1957. She has 3 children, a hard-working husband, and a home filled with all the modern conveniences: an automatic dishwasher, a vacuum with chrome accents, a refrigerator with pastel doors. She should be happy. That's what everyone tells her. But Joan finds herself crying in the laundry room. She wakes with a tightness in her chest. Sometimes she feels like screaming for no reason at all. Her doctor tells her it's just nerves, normal, for a woman in her position. He scribbles a prescription without looking up. "Take 2 when you feel overwhelmed," he says, "and try not to worry so much." Joan takes the pills. They work, at first. The panic fades. Her tears stop. She feels less raw. But she also feels distant, disconnected. Her days pass in a fog. She forgets what she said, where she's put things. The silence inside her grows heavier, not lighter. She tells her doctor, and he increases the dose. This was the experience of millions of women in mid-century America. Between 1960 and 1975, prescriptions for tranquilizers soared, with women accounting for the overwhelming majority of users. These medications were presented not as treatments for trauma or existential distress, but as lifestyle aids, tools to help women cope with the very roles that were exhausting them. No one asked if the problem was the role itself. Instead, the problem was defined as the woman's inability to endure it gracefully. The messaging was everywhere. Magazine ads featured glamorous women holding bottles of pills with taglines like, "You can't set her free, but you can help her feel less trapped," or Valium. For the days when being everything to everyone feels like too much, the assumption was clear. A woman's distress was not a signal that something was wrong with her life. It was an inconvenience that needed to be managed, quietly, medically, elegantly. And yet, beneath the chemical calm, something stirred. The 1960s were not just a time of sedation, they were also a time of awakening. As civil rights movements ignited and youth culture rebelled against conformity, many women began to question the narratives they'd been fed. Books like Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique gave voice to a growing unease, describing what she called the problem that has no name, a sense of dissatisfaction and despair that haunted women who had seemingly achieved the American dream. Friedan didn't blame hormones or hysteria. She blamed the culture, the lack of purpose, the silencing of ambition, the erasure of identity beneath domestic perfection. Women gathered in living rooms and community centers, sharing their stories for the first time. They compared symptoms. They discovered they were not alone. One woman described feeling invisible. Another said she had everything and still wanted to disappear. Another confessed she had started drinking at lunch just to get through the afternoon. Their stories were not about weakness. They were about pressure. About being told that love and family should be enough, even when their own needs were never named. For the first time in modern history, women began connecting the dots between personal suffering and systemic oppression. They recognized that their anxiety was not a flaw in their character, but a reaction to a world that asked too much and offered too little in return. They began to demand more, not just more freedom or opportunity, but more honesty, more space to feel, to speak, to question, more room to be human. Still, the medical establishment was slow to respond. Psychiatry in the 60s and 70s was heavily influenced by pharmaceutical companies, which had little incentive to explore deeper causes when a daily dose of diazepam could be prescribed in 5 minutes. Doctors, most of whom were men, often dismissed women's concerns as emotional or overly sensitive. Therapy remained a luxury, and even when it was available, it often echoed older ideas, that women's distress was due to unrealistic expectations, not real limitations. But change, once begun, is hard to contain. As the feminist movement gained momentum, women entered medicine, psychology, and academia. not just as patients but as practitioners. They began to write books, lead research, and challenge the frameworks that had pathologized them for decades. They introduced new questions. What if trauma was not rare but common? What if emotional labor was a form of unpaid work? What if anxiety was not a disorder, but a warning? These were radical ideas at the time, but they planted seeds that would grow in the years to come. The 70s and 80s would see further shifts. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM, expanded to include more specific diagnoses like generalized anxiety disorder and panic disorder. The field of trauma studies began to emerge, though it was still in its infancy. The language of mental health became more precise, but the systems remained flawed. Medications evolved, but the model remained the same: suppress symptoms, maintain function, avoid disruption. And for many women, the message remained unchanged. If you're not happy, take a pill. If you're overwhelmed, see a doctor. If you're still struggling, lower your expectations. But even as those messages persisted, a new generation of women was listening to each other, to the past, to the quiet voice inside that refused to be drowned out. They began to reclaim their stories, not as case studies, not as metaphors, but as truth. The suburban dream had been a sedative, but dreams, by their nature, fade. And what followed in its wake was the sharp, clear recognition that anxiety is not a flaw. It is a signal, a language, a demand to be heard. Next, we step into the 1980s and 1990s, an era of diagnosis, new medications, and the slow institutionalization of mental health care. Where Prozac entered the mainstream, insurance began to cover therapy, and mental illness started gaining legitimacy in medical discourse. But even with progress, the question still lingered. Would women finally be heard, or just better labeled? The 1980s and 1990s are often remembered for bold colors, consumerism, and a cultural obsession with progress. Personal computers arrived in living rooms, cable TV flooded homes with entertainment, and Wall Street declared that greed was good. But beneath the surface of neon lights and corporate ambition, a quieter revolution was taking place. One that unfolded not in boardrooms or on runways, but in clinics, therapists' offices, and pharmacies. Mental health, for the first time in centuries, was being taken seriously. Not metaphorically, not spiritually, but medically. And for women who had long been dismissed, this seemed like it might finally be the beginning of understanding. The truth, as always, was more complicated. By the 1980s, psychiatry had undergone a transformation. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM, had evolved into a more structured and expansive guidebook for clinicians. New diagnoses were being added, clarified, and debated. Generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder. All these terms began to replace the vague and often condescending labels of previous eras. The word hysteria quietly disappeared from clinical use, a small but symbolic victory. At last, the field acknowledged that fear, dread, and disorientation weren't just character flaws. They were conditions. For many women, this change brought a kind of validation they had never known. Imagine being a woman named Denise in 1986. For years, you've felt a rising sense of tension in your body, like a string pulled too tight. Your heart races without reason. You avoid social situations, and you wake in the middle of the night with the feeling that you're drowning. In the past, you might have been told you were just emotional or too sensitive. But now, your therapist tells you that you are experiencing panic disorder. She explains the neurological mechanisms behind it, shows you data, offers a treatment plan. And in that moment, something shifts. You are no longer a mystery. You are understood. But understanding, as powerful as it is, comes at a cost when it is reduced to clinical language. The diagnostic model, for all its structure, sometimes flattens complexity. Anxiety is labeled, categorized, and assigned a number in a manual. But what of the story behind it? What of the loss, the trauma, the chronic stress, the relentless caretaking, the broken dreams? What of the loneliness that comes from never being asked what you want? These don't fit neatly into the codes of the DSM, and so, in many ways, women continue to fall through the cracks. The rise of pharmaceutical treatment further complicated the landscape. New medications, SSRIs like Prozac, Zoloft, and Paxil, entered the market and quickly became household names. They were promoted as revolutionary, less habit-forming than older sedatives, and capable of rebalancing brain chemistry with minimal side effects. For many, they truly did offer relief. Women who had been paralyzed by anxiety found themselves able to function again. Mothers who had been numb with despair found themselves laughing at their children's jokes. The drugs worked, but they also came with baggage. As prescriptions increased, so did the pressure to medicate rather than investigate. Doctors, often overburdened and undertrained in psychotherapy, began relying on SSRIs as first-line interventions. A woman might come in reporting symptoms of anxiety, and within 15 minutes, leave with a prescription, but no deeper exploration of why she felt as she did. Was it grief? Burnout? Abuse? Financial insecurity? Generational trauma? These questions were often left unasked. The system rewarded efficiency, not empathy. And so, a pattern emerged. Women were increasingly seen as legitimate patients, yes, but only if they fit within the diagnostic mold. If their symptoms aligned with criteria, if their pain could be quantified and treated on a pharmaceutical timeline. If they cried during an appointment, they might be marked as overly emotional. If they didn't cry, perhaps they were in denial. The nuance was lost. The humanity was diluted. And though they were no longer burned at the stake or locked away in convents, they were still in many ways being misunderstood. Therapy, too, was evolving. Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, gained popularity, offering structured tools to reframe negative thought patterns and develop coping mechanisms. For many women, this was a welcome alternative to decades of medical paternalism. But it also had limitations. CBT focused heavily on thought processes, often overlooking the emotional and historical context of those thoughts. A woman who had endured a decade of emotional neglect might be taught to challenge her cognitive distortions, but not invited to explore the origin of her self-doubt. Moreover, access remained unequal. Therapy was still expensive and often uncovered by insurance. Finding a therapist who understood the intersection of gender, trauma, and cultural pressure could be a daunting task. Many women found themselves explaining their lives to therapists who had no framework for understanding them beyond clinical definitions. The phrase, "I feel like I have to teach my therapist about my life," became all too common. And yet, there were sparks of change. Women began entering the field of psychology in greater numbers. Feminist therapy models emerged, emphasizing the social and political dimensions of mental health. Therapists began exploring the ways in which societal expectations, beauty standards, motherhood, caretaking, contributed to chronic stress and anxiety in women. Books and essays flourished, telling the truth behind the clinical facade. Authors like Carol Gilligan, Judith Herman, and Bell Hooks expanded the conversation, weaving together psychology, feminism, and lived experience. They asked, what if we stopped asking what's wrong with her and started asking what happened to her? It was a radical question, and one that began to ripple across disciplines. Social work, education, even criminal justice began to adopt trauma-informed lenses, recognizing that behaviors often labeled as problematic were actually survival strategies. Hypervigilance wasn't irrational, it was learned. Emotional withdrawal wasn't laziness, it was protection. Panic wasn't madness, it was memory. Still, cultural stigma remained. A woman disclosing a mental health diagnosis risked being seen as fragile or unstable. Media portrayals lagged behind the science. Films and television often depicted mentally ill women as dangerous, unstable, or defined entirely by their diagnoses. The crazy ex-girlfriend trope thrived, reducing complex emotional pain to a punchline. Even as society learned to name disorders, it hadn't yet learned to respect those who lived with them. And so the end of the 20th century arrived with both hope and hesitation. Women had gained legal rights, access to education, professional opportunities, But emotional freedom still lagged behind. Yes, anxiety had a name, it had a pill, it had a code and a manual, but did it have a listener? Did it have a space to speak its whole truth? That question remained unanswered. As we prepare to step into the new millennium, we will find that something begins to shift again. Quietly, profoundly, the language of trauma starts to replace the language of disorder. Instead of asking how to fix women, clinicians begin to ask how to support them. Instead of dismissing symptoms, professionals start to see them as clues. And women themselves lead the charge, drawing connections across generations, cultures, and histories. The final chapters of this story are not yet complete, but they begin with a whisper. It's not in your head. It's in your story. The dawn of the new millennium arrived on a wave of digital optimism. The world was wired. Communication was instant. Self-help books flew off shelves. Online therapy platforms blossomed. And the phrase mental health became a staple in both political speeches and Instagram captions. For the first time, it seemed, society was truly ready to talk about the mind, its fragility, its brilliance, and all the mess in between. But amidst this cultural awakening, another truth began to rise like a long-buried root finally pushing through the soil. Anxiety, for many women, was not just a symptom to be medicated, but a story waiting to be told. Not a malfunction, but a signal. Not a disorder, but a message that something had gone wrong. Perhaps not inside her, but around her. Enter the rise of trauma-informed care. This approach, part philosophy, part clinical practice, quietly began to reshape how therapists, educators, social workers, and even physicians thought about distress. Instead of asking, "What's wrong with her?" the trauma-informed lens posed a gentler, more curious question. What happened to her? And suddenly the entire narrative shifted. Anxiety was no longer viewed as a random chemical imbalance or a purely biological curse. It became something human, understandable, expected even, when one considered the layers of pain, pressure, and expectation women had carried for generations. Take, for example, the experience of Camilla, a 28-year-old working in urban healthcare in 2004. She excelled at her job, paid her bills on time, and kept a meticulously curated life. But behind her polished exterior was a cascade of relentless worry. She couldn't rest, couldn't say no, couldn't stop the internal voice telling her she was falling short, even when others praised her. She finally found a therapist trained in trauma-informed work, and for the first time, she was asked about more than just her daily stress. They spoke about her upbringing, her cultural expectations, her history of subtle but constant emotional invalidation. And as the sessions unfolded, Camilla realized her anxiety wasn't an intruder. It was a companion she'd developed to survive. It wasn't the enemy. It was the alarm. This shift wasn't just individual, it was systemic. In schools, educators began to recognize that acting out might be a child's response to chronic stress. In hospitals, providers were trained to spot signs of trauma, not just treat symptoms. Even in corporate spaces, mental wellness programs began to offer mindfulness apps, meditation pods, and burnout seminars, not always effectively, but as a sign that something had changed in the cultural air, and women, once relegated to whispering their truths in secret, began to speak louder. They flooded social media with essays, stories, confessions. They wrote memoirs that hit bestseller lists. They created podcasts, ran blogs, shared TikToks with captions like, "If you're anxious because you had to parent yourself at 7, you're not broken." The message resonated across borders and demographics. Women were connecting the dots between childhood instability, cultural pressures, systemic inequality, and adult anxiety. And they were doing it with a clarity and courage that previous generations had never been allowed. The language evolved too. Words like boundaries, emotional labor, gaslighting, and generational trauma became part of everyday conversation. What once required paragraphs of explanation now fit into hashtags. Anxiety was no longer just a clinical term. It was a shorthand for an entire emotional ecosystem that included burnout, people-pleasing, hypervigilance, and more. And with that evolution came empowerment. For many women, being able to name their experience brought relief. It validated what they had long known but never had the words for. But with new language came new risks. As the wellness industry boomed, corporations saw an opportunity. Terms like self-care were commodified, repackaged into bath bombs and productivity journals. Therapy culture became an aesthetic. Mental health awareness turned into a marketing campaign. While some of this brought genuine support, much of it reduced complex emotional healing into curated checklists and pastel slogans. And once again, women were subtly pushed to manage their symptoms, to find tools, hacks, and rituals to remain functional in a world that still often refused to change. Even more troubling, not all systems evolved equally. Marginalized women, Black women, Indigenous women, disabled women, LGBTQ+ women, often found that trauma-informed language didn't automatically translate into trauma-informed practice. A Black woman expressing justified anger might still be labeled aggressive. A trans woman seeking support might still be misgendered by clinicians. A Latina mother struggling with postpartum anxiety might still be told by a provider, "You're just stressed." The new era promised empathy, but too often delivered it unevenly. Moreover, the accessibility gap remained a chasm. While teletherapy and online resources expanded options, they didn't erase financial barriers. Many therapists charged upwards of $150 per session, and insurance coverage remained inconsistent. Rural areas, despite technological advances, often lacked specialists entirely. And for immigrant communities, language and cultural differences still made mental health care difficult to access, even when it was technically available. Yet in spite of these challenges, the change was real. Women were no longer waiting for permission to name their pain. They were demanding better, not just better treatment, but better systems. They lobbied for maternal mental health policies. They started community collectives offering sliding scale therapy. They studied neuroscience, psychology, and social work, not as observers, but as experts. They were no longer passive recipients of care. They were the architects. Perhaps one of the most profound shifts in this new era was the understanding that anxiety isn't just personal, it's relational. It lives in families, workplaces, cultural scripts. It's passed down not only in genes, but in silence. In subtle messages like, "Don't talk about that," or "Just get over it." In decades of being told to smile, to be nice, to never be too loud, too needy, too angry. And once women began to see that pattern, they began to break it. This led to a new kind of therapy, one that moved beyond symptom management and embraced narrative. Women were invited to explore their lives as stories, to map their emotional responses not as malfunctions, but as chapters. Therapists stopped asking, "How do we fix this?" and started asking, "Where did this begin?" They looked at childhood roles, unprocessed grief, identity suppression. They asked about joy too, about what healing could look like not just in the absence of pain, but in the presence of power. And women began to heal in new ways, not just through clinical treatment, but through art, community, spirituality, activism. Healing became non-linear, layered, and shared. It became less about achieving normalcy and more about reclaiming wholeness. Yet even in this evolved landscape, one final challenge remains. How do we hold space for emotional truth in a world that still often demands performance? How do we allow women to feel and express the full spectrum of their internal lives without fear of being dismissed, pathologized, or punished? That question will carry us into the final block of this journey. Because while we've walked through centuries of misdiagnosis, repression, and silence, the future remains unwritten. And it holds a powerful invitation to build a world where fear is met not with sedation, but with listening, where anxiety is not a disorder to be hidden, but a truth to be honored. The 2020s brought with them a moment that few expected, and none will forget. A global pandemic that halted the world, cracked open the illusion of control, and exposed every thread of fragility in modern life. For millions, it was the first time they had to sit still with themselves. For women, it became a magnifying glass. Suddenly, the emotional labor that had always been invisible became undeniable. The fear, the exhaustion, the relentless caretaking, it was no longer abstract. It was everywhere. And with that exposure came an opening. An opportunity to rethink everything we thought we knew about anxiety. More than ever before, women began to speak without editing. They recorded videos about mental breakdowns. They wrote captions that spoke of trauma and triggers. They built communities that rejected polished perfection in favor of raw honesty. And in this flood of shared truth, something sacred was born. Connection, no longer confined to therapy rooms or journals. The story of women's emotional pain became communal. Social media, often blamed for toxicity, also became a sanctuary. One where women could say, "Me too," not as a slogan, but as a soul cry across timelines and continents. But the evolution didn't stop at awareness. New generations of therapists began practicing what their predecessors only theorized. Therapy became more intersectional, culturally informed, and emotionally attuned. Trauma-informed care matured into something dynamic, no longer just a checklist of principles, but a lived ethic of curiosity, safety, and compassion. The best clinicians no longer acted as interpreters of women's pain. They sat beside it, asked better questions, and held space when the answers came without words. Research also caught up. Neuroscience began to validate what women had been saying for centuries, that anxiety is often rooted not in disorder, but in memory, in lived experience, that chronic stress reshapes the brain, that hypervigilance is an adaptive response to danger, not a defect, that the body remembers what the mind tries to forget. The more we learned, the clearer it became. Anxiety is not a glitch. It is a story the nervous system is trying to tell in the only language it knows. This understanding gave rise to new therapies, somatic experiencing, EMDR, internal family systems, each offering tools not just for managing symptoms, but for reclaiming the self. Not the self women were told to be, but the self they had buried to survive. These therapies didn't start with "what's wrong with you?" They started with "where does it hurt?" And still, amidst all this progress, the work remains unfinished. For every woman who finds a supportive therapist, there are still others silenced by stigma. For every mental health initiative, there are still schools where girls are punished for emotional expression, workplaces where breakdowns are shamed, homes where vulnerability is weaponized. The path is better, but it is not yet clear. The world, even now, still struggles to let women feel without flinching. But women have changed. They are no longer waiting to be rescued or translated. They are not asking for permission to speak. They are building their own frameworks, creating their own language, defining healing on their own terms. They are mothers teaching daughters how to name their feelings, partners refusing to carry the weight of everyone's comfort, professionals leading workshops on mental health and gender equity. They are not just surviving. They are remembering who they were before the silence. And perhaps that is the greatest shift of all. For centuries, women were taught that fear was a flaw, that anxiety made them unreliable, that their emotions were inconvenient, irrational, excessive. Now they are learning to see their feelings as sacred data, emotional intelligence passed down through blood, bone, and lineage. The dread that used to paralyze is now a clue. The restlessness that once shamed is now a compass. The panic that used to isolate is now a common language, spoken across identities and generations. The future of women's mental health doesn't lie in more pills or tighter diagnoses. It lies in permission. Permission to feel deeply. Permission to grieve what was never safe to speak. Permission to be messy, afraid, and resilient all at once. It lies in connection, not just between therapist and client, but between women themselves. It lies in education, policy, art, spirituality, friendship. It lies in stories told at midnight over texts that begin with, "I don't know who else to tell this to." So, if you're a woman watching this, and you've ever felt that tightness in your chest, that unexplained panic at 2 a.m., that relentless voice telling you you're not doing enough, know this: you're not broken. You're responding to a world that asked you to shrink and a life that deserves your full breath. Your anxiety is not your enemy. It's your signal, and it's speaking not only for you, but for every woman who never got the chance. And if you've made it to this point in the video, I want to say something clearly, from the heart. Thank you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for staying. Thank you for holding space for a story that is heavy but real. You are part of something bigger now, a community of truth-tellers, of survivors, of people who are done pretending everything's fine when it's not. If this video spoke to something inside you, please subscribe to the channel. Not out of obligation, but because you believe in stories that matter. And if you feel comfortable, share yours in the comments. Tell us where you come from. Tell us what resonated. Tell us when you first knew your fear wasn't just yours, that it had a history, that it had meaning. This space is for you, and I promise here, you will never be told to whisper. Not again. Until next time, stay brave, stay soft, and never let anyone convince you that your truth is too much, because it isn't. It never was.